For billion miles from Earth, a tiny, frozen ball of rock and ice drifts through the void. By all accounts, it should be utterly lifeless. No weather, no wind, no surprises. Just a lump of ice, condemned to sit silently in the dark for eternity. But scientists have just discovered that this diminutive world is doing something that sounds almost unbelievable. It is actively cooling itself down, using nothing but its own sky. Out beyond the orbit of every planet you've ever heard of, there exists a place that is inexplicably colder than mathematical models say it should be. For years, the very notion of how this could happen was met with laughter from seasoned researchers. Then, a giant telescope was aimed directly at it, and proved that the joke was, in fact, reality. This is the story of Pluto, the little world that was famously voted out of the Planet Club, only to turn around and astonish the scientists still watching it. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a ball of ice smaller than our moon can run its own private refrigerator, and why that single, strange fact might just be a clue about life itself. Let's start from the beginning. Back in 1930, a young man named Clyde Tombaugh sat in a small observatory in Arizona, staring endlessly at photographic plates of the night sky. His task was deliberately monotonous. Compare images taken on different nights and search for a single tiny but that had shifted position. Night after night, nothing happened. Then, one day it did. A faint speck of light had moved, ever so slightly, against the background of fixed stars. That speck was Pluto. For the next 76 years, children everywhere grew up learning that Pluto was the 9th planet in our solar system. But in 2006, a group of scientists convened to vote on a new, official definition of what constitutes a planet, and Pluto didn't make the cut. It was reclassified as a dwarf planet, a decision that upset people around the globe. It felt as though Pluto had been unjustly exiled from a club it had belonged to its entire existence. Here's the wild part, though. That demotion didn't make Pluto boring. On the contrary, it set the stage for one of the most bizarre discoveries ever made about any world in our solar system. To understand why, you have to appreciate just how little we knew about Pluto for most of the last century. Even with our best Earth-based telescopes, Pluto appeared as nothing more than a fuzzy, indistinct smudge of light. We couldn't determine its true size, we couldn't see its surface, and we had no idea if it even possessed an atmosphere. Everything people thought they knew about Pluto was essentially a guess built upon another guess. Let's put its size into perspective. If Earth were the size of a basketball, Pluto would be smaller than a golf ball, and it would be floating roughly 40 times farther from the sun than we are. Out there, sunlight is so feeble that even standing on Pluto at high noon would feel like a deep, heavy twilight here on Earth. The cold is almost too extreme to fathom. The surface temperature hovers around minus 380 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 229 degrees Celsius, more than 250 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the lowest temperature ever recorded anywhere on our entire planet. At that frigid temperature, nitrogen, the very gas you're breathing right now, freezes solid as rock. So, Pluto being cold isn't the surprise. Everyone expected that. The shock is that it turned out to be even colder than that extreme math predicted. Something out there was making it chillier than it had any right to be, and for a long time, nobody could explain how. The first real clue came in 2015, when a spacecraft finally got close enough to take a proper look. What it found would forever change what scientists thought they understood about this little world. In July 2015, after nearly a decade of hurtling through space, a small spacecraft called New Horizons finally reached Pluto. It had exactly one chance to get it right. There would be no slowing down, no turning around for a second look. It zoomed past at over 30,000 miles per hour, with only a few precious minutes to gather as much data as possible before shooting off into the darkness forever. The images it sent back completely shattered the picture scientists had built in their heads. Right in the middle of Pluto's surface sat a massive, pale patch, shaped almost perfectly like a heart. It looked smooth and strangely young compared to the old, crater-riddled terrain surrounding it. Nearby, mountains made of solid water ice rose more than 10,000 feet into the sky. At those freezing temperatures, water ice doesn't act soft or slippery like it does on Earth. It behaves more like solid rock, hard enough that, if struck, it would almost ring like metal. But the detail that truly caught everyone off guard was something floating above it all. Layer upon layer of soft, blue haze extended hundreds of miles above Pluto's surface. It even glowed when sunlight hit it from behind. Nobody expected a small, cold, supposedly dead world to have anything like that hanging in its sky. At the time, scientists had no way to determine what that haze was actually doing. Was it just floating there for show? Or was it somehow connected to why Pluto felt colder than it should? New Horizons couldn't answer that. It had gotten its one look and then continued its journey deeper into the dark, farther from the sun than it will ever return from. Whatever secrets that haze was hiding would remain hidden until scientists found a completely different way to study them. What they needed wasn't another photograph. Pictures alone couldn't reveal what the haze was made of or how it affected the surrounding air. They needed a tool that could read Pluto's sky from millions of miles away, without ever sending another spacecraft near it. That tool did exist. It just hadn't been built yet when New Horizons flew by. And once it finally turned its attention toward that little heart-shaped world, everything scientists thought they knew about Pluto's atmosphere was about to be turned upside down. Here's what makes the next part of the story so different from everything that came before. New Horizons functioned like a camera, snapping pictures at top speed as it flew past. But the new James Webb Space Telescope, Webb, doesn't work that way at all. Instead of taking a picture, it reads light itself, breaking it apart the way a prism splits sunlight into a rainbow, and using that rainbow to deduce exactly what something is made of, all without ever leaving Earth's corner of the solar system. Think of it this way. Imagine you could tell what someone had for breakfast just by looking closely at their breath from across a room. That's essentially what Webb does, except instead of breath, it reads tiny bits of light bouncing off a world 4 billion miles away. There was a problem, though. Pluto and its largest moon, Charon, sit so close together in the sky that separating their light was almost impossible for older telescopes. It was like trying to hear one friend whispering while standing right next to someone shouting. Scientists tried for years to catch a clear signal from Pluto's haze alone, but they kept coming up empty. Not because the signal wasn't there, but because Charon's light kept drowning it out. Then, in 2022, Webb's instruments proved sharp enough to pull those two signals apart. For the first time ever, scientists could examine Pluto completely on its own, and what they found confirmed a theory that one scientist had proposed years earlier, back when almost nobody believed him. In 2017, a scientist named Shizhong had an idea that sounded almost backwards. Everyone knew that hazy skies usually work like a blanket, trapping heat close to the ground. Zhang, however, proposed that Pluto's haze might be doing the exact opposite. He believed it was absorbing the weak sunlight during the day and then radiating that heat straight back out into space, faster than Pluto's thin atmosphere could ever hold on to it. In other words, instead of acting like a blanket, the haze would be acting like a tiny radiator, quietly bleeding heat away from a world that barely had any warmth to spare. At the time, many scientists thought this idea was a stretch, and there was no way to actually test it. That changed in 2025, when a team led by scientist Tanga Bertrand used Webb's new, sharper vision to measure Pluto's atmosphere directly. The results, published that June, matched Zhang's idea almost perfectly. Pluto's upper atmosphere really is being cooled by the haze floating within it, and it turned out to be about 30 degrees Celsius 54 degrees Fahrenheit colder than older models had predicted. Let that sink in for a second. Pluto isn't simply cold because it's far from the sun. In a very real sense, it is actively refrigerating itself, using nothing but the haze in its own sky. Scientists are now calling it a completely new kind of climate, one that doesn't resemble anything else we've ever studied in the solar system. And here's the bigger question this discovery opened up. If a tiny world like Pluto can quietly chill its own sky using nothing but haze, what else might similar hazy worlds be doing out there that we haven't noticed yet? That haze turned out to be hiding one more secret, and it leads us straight into one of the strangest relationships between any two worlds we've ever found. Pluto has been slowly leaking its atmosphere into space for billions of years. Gas from its thin sky drifts upward, slips past Pluto's weak gravitational pull, and floats off into the void. Scientists already knew this was happening. What they didn't know for a long time was where all that escaping gas was actually going. It turns out, it wasn't just disappearing. Something was catching it. Pluto's biggest moon, a battered ice world named Charon, orbits incredibly close to its parent planet. They are locked together in a strange kind of gravitational dance. Most of Charon looks like plain, cratered water ice, gray and unremarkable, except at its poles. Both poles are stained a deep, unmistakable reddish-brown, darker than anything else on the moon's surface. For years, scientists suspected that color was somehow connected to Pluto, but they couldn't prove it. Here's how the pieces finally fit together. Because of the way Charon is tilted as it circles Pluto, its north pole spends decades sitting in complete darkness at a time. No sunlight reaches it during that stretch, which makes it an incredibly effective trap for cold gas. Escaping bits of Pluto's atmosphere drift over, freeze solid onto that dark, frozen pole, and accumulate for years, waiting. When sunlight finally returns to that part of the moon, something strange happens. The frozen gas doesn't simply melt away as you'd expect. Instead, the sunlight and cosmic rays smash the frozen molecules apart, then glue the leftover pieces back together into heavier, reddish compounds. This new reddish material doesn't evaporate. It remains permanently locked onto the surface, deepening that dark stain a little more with every single cycle. In other words, two separate worlds, one giving away pieces of its sky, the other quietly catching them and turning them into color, have been locked in this slow, chemical trade for longer than either has even had a name. And Charon had one more surprise in store. In 2024, a team led by scientist Sylvia Protopapa used Webb to take a closer look at Charon's surface and found something nobody had confirmed there before: frozen carbon dioxide, the same gas we exhale with every breath, and hydrogen peroxide, the same stuff used to clean cuts. The carbon dioxide likely came from material buried underground, dug up by ancient impacts, while the hydrogen peroxide appears to have formed slowly over time as radiation struck Charon's water ice and rearranged it into something new. Just when scientists thought they had Charon figured out as a plain, boring ice ball, it turned out to be far more chemically interesting than anyone expected. So, by this point, here's what we actually know. Pluto is cooling its own sky using haze. That same haze is slowly leaking away, drifting onto its moon, and painting that moon's poles a deep, permanent red. Two frozen worlds, locked together, quietly trading pieces of themselves back and forth for billions of years. But Pluto still had one more layer of mystery buried underneath it all, and this next part might be the strangest piece of the whole story. Let's go back to Pluto's surface for a moment, because New Horizons photographed something down there that nobody had ever seen anywhere else in the solar system. In a region later named Tartarus Dorsa, tall, jagged blades of ice rise up in long rows, some reaching more than 1,500 feet high, all made of frozen methane. Similar, much smaller versions of these blades exist here on Earth, in certain high mountain deserts, where they rarely grow taller than an average person. On Pluto, that same basic process appears to have played out on a massive scale over a much longer time frame. A 2025 reanalysis of the New Horizons data suggests these towering ice blades might wrap around as much as 60% of Pluto's equator, forming a jagged ring of frozen teeth encircling the entire little world. Not far from that famous heart-shaped plain, there are two enormous, isolated mountains that scientists still can't fully explain. One rises about 13,000 feet high. The other might reach nearly 20,000 feet, wide enough at the base to rival some of the biggest volcanoes on Earth. Both have deep dips at their peaks, ringed by cracks, with lumpy sides that look almost exactly like cooled lava flows. Except there's no melted rock on Pluto. If these mountains really are what they appear to be, they are ice volcanoes, places that once pushed up a thick, slushy mix of water, ammonia, and methane from somewhere deep beneath Pluto's frozen crust. And that raises the single biggest question hanging over this entire story. If something down there was warm enough to push liquid material all the way up through miles of solid ice, could that warmth still exist today? Scientists believe it's possible that Pluto harbors a liquid ocean buried about 100 miles beneath its icy exterior, kept from freezing solid by heat still leaking from its rocky core. This isn't a proven fact, but a pattern. Surface cracks line up exactly the way you'd expect if a layer of liquid water were shifting slowly underneath. And that heart-shaped plane sits directly above a spot where something denser than the surrounding ice appears to be lurking below, almost like a heavy weight pressing upward from the depths. If that hidden ocean really exists, it has been sealed away from sunlight for billions of years, sitting in total darkness under crushing pressure, fed only occasionally by material seeping down through cracks above. That would make it one of the most bizarre potential habitats in the entire solar system, a place where the raw ingredients for life might exist, cut off completely from any star. And there's one more piece to this puzzle that ties everything together. Even the faint trickle of sunlight reaching Pluto is enough to break apart methane gas high in its atmosphere. Those broken fragments don't just vanish. They slowly rebuild themselves into heavier, reddish-brown particles that drift down and settle onto the surface. This same kind of material belongs to a group of molecules that some scientists believe may have once rained down onto early Earth, possibly providing the raw ingredients from which life eventually emerged. On Pluto, that exact same process has been quietly running for roughly 4 billion years, a slow, steady snowfall of life's building blocks, falling forever onto a world simply too frozen for any of it to ever spark into something alive. So where does that leave us? Pluto was never the dead, and everyone assumed it was back when it lost its planet title in 2006. Instead, it became the beginning of a whole new set of questions. It sits within a vast, mostly unexplored region called the Kuiper Belt, home to hundreds of thousands of icy worlds we've barely even glanced at. If one small, frozen, formerly dismissed dwarf planet was hiding all of this, a self-cooling sky, a moon quietly stealing its air, possible ice volcanoes, and maybe even a hidden ocean, it's worth wondering what else might be sitting out there in the dark, waiting for us to finally take a closer look. If this kind of story blew your mind a little, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you catch the next one the second it drops. I've got more strange, real space stories coming, and you won't want to miss them. Before you go, I want to know what you think. If there really is a hidden ocean sitting under all that ice on Pluto, sealed away in total darkness for billions of years, what do you think could be down there? Or do you think it's just water and nothing more? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, go check out the video link below about Europa's hidden ocean. It might just be even stranger than this one.